All right. Today we are going to be discussing all of the intricacies of D23s and making requests and changes, etc. So with that, we have legislation requirements, D23s related to debt issuance, related to suspense accounts, how we go about linking cash, filling out the form, and what GAAP fund and G54 indicators are and what they represent on the form and for the fund. And then we go through some system jobs using the D23 profile, closing the Treasury funds and cash funds. And then we also have SARS here with us today to go over some of how they review the D23 requests and their portion in that. And lastly, we're going to finish up with GAAP fund selection decisions. And if there is time allowing, changing a D23. Before I turn it over to Carlene, I just want to say that we do have a lot of information to go over, but definitely encourage everyone to please use this as the learning opportunity and to ask questions in the chat. There will be answer sections basically at the end of each section. So the more questions you put into chat, the more we can have a conversation and ensure everybody has a good understanding. With that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Carlene. Take it away, Carlene.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the D23 training that we have biannually. This is the advanced, so if you did have an opportunity or did not have an opportunity to go to the original D23 basic training, please take the time. It is out on the recording and the PowerPoint are both available on our SFMS website. If you have any questions on how to get there, please send me an email and I'll send you a link. Okay, every D23, no matter how small or large, every D23 requires legislation, legal legislation. The documentation, this legal legislation should be we're going to talk about engrossed first, which is legislation that has only passed one chamber of the House. This legislation is subject to change, so don't hang your hat on it. Changes can occur, and don't submit it for a D23 fund as soon as it's out of one chamber and into another, because it is not considered complete. It's still considered a document in progress or process, and it is not appropriate to submit a D23 with this, and it will be rejected by SFMS without question. However, enrolled legislation has been voted on by both houses and is ready for the signatures of the House Speaker and the Senate President and Governor, and we need all three of those signatures to be on the document. And once this is done, it's signed and is considered legal legislation, and this will either become chapter law or an ORS. And this is the primary source of all legislation that is needed for a D23 request. And this is particularly important because I realize that we're starting towards the end of the legislative cycle that we are, starting in for AY 27 or fiscal year 26. And a lot of the legislation is kind of at this point in the halfway point, is not completely been signed off, is probably more in the engrossed stage, but it's the enrolled stage through governor's signature that I am looking for. So the documentation for the D23, the ORS and chapter law can be found once in the history portion of the tab. It'll also tell me what dates the president or the speaker has signed it, when the governor has signed it. It'll also tell me when it's active and available a lot of times, effective date in there. So this I check for every single new piece of legislation that comes through to make sure everything is proper and in its place. But you can do this before you send it to me. That is the most, I cannot stress how appreciative I am. And if I'm on vacation, Liz is, if this is taken on by the agency versus being an SFMS responsibility. E-board minutes can also, at this time of year, can also be part of our legal legislation. The e-board minutes occur most often in the middle to the end of our biennium. They grant agencies additional funding or spending authority. They can address agency receipt of grant monies and give them the spending authority, because sometimes you're given grants, but you don't have the authority to spend them by the legislation. And that's what we're really looking for in a D23. And they, generally speaking, are not the source of new legislation or programs. So that's e-board minutes. We look for an effective start date. Written into the legislation is found generally in the last section of the bill. It's effective immediately upon the governor's signature. It can give us a specific date. It can give us that specific date can be months in advance or in arrears. So just be aware that, generally speaking, that last paragraph in the legislation sometimes has that effective start date written into it. If there is no specific information provided regarding this effective start date, then we look for 90 days after Sendai or the legislation ends, which is, I believe, June 30th. So it's in September that we're looking for that start date. This is the most common, and after a regular legislative session has ended. So that's what we'll be looking for in the coming months. Sub-account Treasury legislation. In the last couple of years, this has been something that has arisen. And Treasury can choose or not allow sub-accounts. This is not an SFMS decision. Currently, Treasury is not allowing sub-account setups. And these sub-accounts are written into its old language in a legislation that sometimes is pulled forward into new legislation. So if you see Treasury sub-accounts in the legislation, the agency may need to set up a Treasury account separate from the general fund. That's what we're always looking for. Treasury fund setup is separate and distinct from the general fund, is the magic language. And then legislation as agreed by Treasury is House bill or a Senate bill with a sub-account language, and then ORS 291.001. And this is a very, very general ORS that is only to be used in very specific certain situations. If you ever have a question about when it's appropriate to use this or not, please contact SFMS, either Liz or myself. We would be happy to help you through this. And then please work with Oregon State Treasury to make sure that any reference to a Treasury account is properly worded in your legislative concept document. We have found this year alone, I think there were a couple agencies who assumed that certain language is in the bill, and it has caused them no end of trouble, and they had to literally go back and have a correction to the legislation written up for this cycle and get it passed through so that they could change essentially where the interest was being credited. So be very careful, work with the state treasury for properly worded legislation. The legislative concept phase is the one time to make sure that language does not impede the agency's ability to execute legal legislation. So it's their time to make things very clear and very appropriate. It's not an SFMS role to review verbiage of legislative concept regarding Treasury funds. So please don't send it to me. I can't make comment on it. I don't, that's not my role. And SFMS's role really begins after the House bill or Senate bill is fully executed through that governor's signature. So there you go. Do you have any questions about the legal legislation that we're looking for? And we are generally speaking looking for the spending authority. So a lot of times they're budgetary bills, a lot of times they're sections with money specifically addressed in them, how those monies should be spent. Those are the legal legislation that SFMS is looking for when we are reviewing the D23 funds. So Amber, do I have any questions that I need to address through this section?
You had some link questions, and I think that we got those answered.
Okay.
And then Brian just says that agencies can contact their Treasury Customer Solutions analyst for assistance with legislative language as well. So
thank you, Brian.
Yeah. Oh, he has some more. Regarding sub-accounts, Treasury systems cannot support sub-accounts. It's not a matter of Treasury allowing or not. So there you go.
Well, there you go. Well, thank you, Brian. Hey. Woo-hoo.
Joint training. We got it.
Hey, that was very effective for basic training, and I have very wonderful hopes for this one. Okay, because I'm ready to learn too. Okay, let's go on to the next topic, which is D20 funds related to debt issuance. Now, we just had a bunch of bond sales go through. So I'm sure if you guys aren't experts on these bond sales, you are now. Basically, who has the authorization to request bond issuance Treasury accounts? The DAS CFO office, as you know, are the ones that most often send out those XIQ bonds or LRB bonds, and they use and through ORS 286A and 291.001, they are allowed to open Treasury funds for the other agencies, including DAS, for these bond issuances. So not just anybody from the agency can say, hey, we're having an XIQ bond sale, I'm going to open a Treasury fund. No, you can't. DAS is responsible for that. Other than these three agencies that I'm going to tell you about, which are Education's, Veterans, and Housing and Community Service. These all have identified and separate ORSs unique to these agencies that basically allow them to issue their own bonds for their different programs. So anybody outside of Education, Veterans, and Housing all the bond sales go through DAS. Bond issuance legal legislation is never the same, ever the same as DAS CFO's office used to request the Treasury funds. Remember, SFMS is always looking for the budgetary legal legislation that you're allowed to spend these monies. So the legal legislation must be the agency's expenditure authority, be it an HB, SB, or an E-board minute, with the appropriate section and, if appropriate, subsection of the legislation. Now, this has been a bit of a big bugaboo for me. I have had a number of agencies just say in the last month or so, just send me HB 5005. Well, there are 4, 5, 6, 7 pages of HB 5005. Several agencies are involved in that bill, and there are a lot of line items with a lot of budgetary numbers. I need it all. If what you're giving me is a specific bill, and it has a section, and then it has 50 line items under it, I want to know exactly what line, what number, all of it. I want it all. I want basically the fastest way to get something through review process is to have all the information present. And if you are so kind to put the request and the legislation highlighted together and send it to me for review, and then I just have to go, oh, here's this, yes, tick, tick. That gets through faster than my having to look for every single piece of information. This is me trying to have you help me, essentially, if that makes sense. But if all you give me is HB 5005 or whatever legislation it is with the section 1, line item L, it's A under L, so it'd be, section 1, L, A, or B, or whatever. Whatever it is you want me to get to, put it all there. But ORS 286 and 291 are not appropriate, so give me the HBSBE board. ORS used by the DAS CFO office is just generally too general and directly states that DAS purposes to open a Treasury accounts for other agencies. It does not address spending limits or grant authority to spend the monies received. So there you go on that. Oh, and the other thing I want to point out, the legal legislation. See this section? This is a cutout of the D23 form. Are there any legal legislation expenditures? Yes or no? So blah, blah. It then says, please list specific law or other authority. This space underneath that is where the legal legislation is to be placed. If it's placed anywhere else on the form, I may see it, but really to be the first place I look on each and every one of these forms is right in this box to say, what crumbs have they given me? If this is blank, it will be immediately rejected and sent back to you, and I will say, I need the legal legislation. It doesn't matter if it's in the description box. It can be there. That's great, grand and glorious if it's appropriate, but I need it in that box. So there you go. And then bond issues, additional notes. SARS has a training for this. They gave a few years back regarding accounting and reporting of bonds. And then other sources is the XIQ Bond Program Agency Guide, which is also on the Oregon.gov website. So do you have any questions regarding D23s? And what we're looking for? I know I didn't go over the GAAP funds or the G54 indicators. That's more of a SARS things. I cannot advise on those. So always go to your SARS analyst. And luckily today we have one who's going to talk about some of that information. So any questions regarding bond issuances and what SFMS is looking for?
Doesn't look like we have any questions this time. Thanks, Carlene.
I either answered all of them or I totally confused them, but either way.
Answered all of them.
Okay. D23 funds using a suspense account. We still have agencies that have suspense accounts and they set them up every day. I get lots of questions, so let's talk about it. Agencies work directly with Oregon State Treasury to set up suspense accounts, or what they call TRS accounts. Setup requests are outside of SFMS and purview, and as such, SFMS does not directly request anything from the agencies regarding suspense accounts. However, there's always an exception to every rule. If there is check writing authority is needed, or if some kind of linking is needed, as far as I had an agency that wanted to be able to do a BT for revenue purposes, not check writing purposes, but check writing purposes. It needs to be approved of by State Treasury and FBF manager. State and budgetary controls don't exist in SFMA for a suspense account, so this must be considered when requesting a D23 and requesting these accounts to be set up at Oregon State Treasury. If there is check writing, if they are trying to do revenue transfers, SFMS will create a separate 8,000 number in the system. No, you don't get to pick it. That's SFMS's job for all Treasury funds set up in RSTARS. And that'll be set up so that it links flawlessly with Treasury. D23 is associated with suspense accounts with no check writing authority. Your elements are local fund indicators should be S for suspense. That stops any check writing. Treasury fund is equal to 999 Oregon default, and agency budget will be a 0 because obviously there's no appropriated funds for it or appropriations for it. D23's associated suspense accounts with check writing authority. Local fund indicators should be N. I would expect it. Treasury fund, here it is. Will be started with an 8,000 number. It's an SFMS assigned once notified by OST and communicated to the agency. And then the agency budget is still equal to 0. And then additional resources for suspense account information is the SFMS desk manual. Categories should be Treasury, and chapter is the Treasury.5. Suspense account transactions in RSTARS, and the link is provided, basically State of Oregon Accounting System, SFMS desk manual. So any questions about D23s that have associated suspense accounts or are set up with suspense accounts? Well, okay. Okay, Liz is going to talk about linking cash.
Thank you, Carlene. Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Schultz. I'm the SFMS Senior Operations Analyst. I'm going to switch gears a bit and talk about linking cash. This is one of our more advanced D23 fund topics. You may also have heard this referred to as linking allotment. So before I dive in, I would just like to get an idea for our audience today, a quick informal poll. If your agency uses linking cash, if you do, put a yes in the chat. If you don't, put no. If you're not sure, that's fine. You can put I don't know. Hopefully by the end of these slides, you will know whether or not your agency is one of those agencies that uses linking cash. Okay, seeing quite a few yeses. I'm sure, some no's, some unsure. Okay, great. We have a mix, and that's kind of what I expected. We don't have all agencies using this linking cash functionality. It's for a very specific purpose. And after these slides, even if your agency doesn't use linking cash, I still think it's useful to go over so you can understand some of the options that are available in SFMA. Maybe it's something your agency will need in the future, or maybe if you move around the state, you'll be with another agency that does use linking cash. So I'm going to go over the next slides and talk to you about what that is. And let me know if you have questions. Feel free to type them in the chat as we go, and we will answer them at the end of this section. So linking cash, what it is another option for agencies to manage cash within SFMA. So if you attended our basic D23 fund training, we talked about the D23 cash fund. Linking cash is something that can be put on top of a cash fund to give you some more options. So under normal circumstances for most agency operations, you're getting funds in before you're actually making expenditures to pay them. And we have in our system the 63 cash screen to track how much cash you have available when you're recording your expenditures. Now, if you have general fund appropriations, it's a little bit different. I'm talking about, federal funds, other funds, anything where you're tracking on the 63 screen to see how much available cash you have to spend for that fund or D73 cash fund. So in most cases, you're getting revenue, you're transferring in money, and then you're making expenditures. There are edits in the system that prevent the 63 screen from going negative. You shouldn't be spending more cash than you have. So when we have a problem and agencies may need to figure out solutions is for federal assistance disbursements. This is what we commonly see linked cash used for. Because in that case, most of the time it's reimbursable. You're having to make that cost, that expenditure upfront, and you're going to get reimbursement at a later date. So there are a bunch of different options agencies have to resolve these types of issues. Maybe the agency already has a cash balance they can spend from while they're waiting for federal reimbursement. Maybe they're making transfers to kind of manage the cash for that. Maybe they've gone to Treasury to try to get a line of credit to manage some of that. There are various options. Linked cash functionality is one of those options, and that's the one I want to go over today. So what linking cash does in SFMA is it allows an agency to borrow against an appropriations unexpended allotment balance. So it's almost always a general fund. You have a general fund or appropriation. You're going to be borrowing some of those unspent general fund appropriation dollars to be able to pay those expenditures upfront and allow the 63 screen to go negative up to a point. So I mentioned this isn't common functionality. It's kind of going through a different method of using some of our system edits for cash. So in order for an agency to use linking cash, it does have to be approved. It is a formal process. So linking cash, if your agency has it, you have gone through this process. If it's something you're interested in looking at for your agency, it does require approval by SABRS, the statewide auditing, budgeting, and reporting section, and DAS CFO. They have to review those requests. They will approve it for those agencies. It needs to meet certain requirements. And they actually put a specific dollar amount of how much you're going to be authorized to borrow from your general fund appropriation. They're trying to set that limit at the level where it'll allow you to, do what you need to do for your agency to make those expenditures while not relying too much on general fund while you're waiting for federal reimbursement. So we have more information on the SABRS website about the forms required for linking cash to request it. You may get additional questions or, have some meetings with DAS CFO to talk about the expectation and the dollar amount that threshold would need to be set at. So they're going to be the experts on that. If you have questions on, is this something that would be approved? Is this the best method to handle this? Typically, what we see for these is they meet these following requirements in order to be eligible for linked cash. So it's almost always federal funds. You have a federal fund, D23. It uses a D73 cash fund, and you're requesting to be able to borrow from a similar general fund appropriation. Both the federal funds and the general fund need to be legislatively authorized for the same purpose. So even though we're just temporarily borrowing general fund appropriation, DAD CFO Sabres is still making sure that that's an allowable use of those general funds, even though they're going to be reimbursed later. So there's some evaluation if those general fund dollars can even be spent that way while you're waiting for reimbursement for those expenditures. And both need to use Treasury Fund 0401. That's the statewide general fund account. So your general fund appropriation is going to be using that. The legislature granted you an appropriation and allotment of how much money you can spend out of that general fund. Your D23 federal fund and the cash fund, the D73 cash fund, also needs to be pointed to that 0401 account so that this will work. If these are separate accounts, we can't link cash across different Treasury accounts. So that's another requirement for this to be a potential option. Federal fund is going to be in a separate D73 cash fund from other agency funds. So when you get that approval from Sabres CFO, they're approving, yes, for this specific activity for federal funds, you can borrow from this specific general fund. So if you have a bunch of other D23 funds that also use that same cash fund, we would need to break that out because you're only authorized to do so much with the linked cash. Now, there could be some exceptions to this for your agency. We've got some historic other ways things can be set up. This is what we most commonly see. But if you have any questions on this piece of it, I would definitely recommend starting with Sabres, their Orbit's help desk email, to get some more information. Right now for this biennium, AY25, we have 12 agencies that are currently approved to use linked cash. So again, the majority of agencies aren't using this. Every biennium, Sabres and CFO review to make sure that agency should still have that if it's going to roll forward and they're going to still have linked cash in the next biennium. So that number could change, but it's not widely used across the state. So I'm going to show you how you can see if you have linked cash in the system, what the setup is required for this to work. And if you were one of those people that was unsure whether or not your agency uses linking cash, if you have a second monitor, you can pull up and look and see. How we can tell if you have linking cash is you'll have it set up on the D73 cash fund. So we have just an example we're going to be walking through in these next slides, a made-up agency. It's an older example, but it's still relevant to show you how things work. So we have our cash fund profile. There's some information on here, and at the very bottom, we have 2 lines with related appropriation number. This is where we put the linking, where we allow you to borrow against a specific appropriation if you have been approved for it. So if you're not sure, you could go into our stars, go to the D73 screen, put in your agency, you can press F5 and scroll through. If all of those related appropriation fields are blank for your agency, you don't have linking cash because it has to be set up on the D73 screen to work. So in this case, I can see we've got the agency, we've got the title indicates that this is a federal grant. The related appropriation number that's listed there in this example begins with 8, which means it's general fund. So this is the typical type of example we see where the agency is having federal funds and they're borrowing against a general fund appropriation. Now, we can only associate this linked cash to one appropriation. So if you look at our D73 cash form and you're requesting a linked allotment, linked cash, you can only list one appropriation. We have 2 lines on the screen, but that's just because we have situations where both bienniums are open at the same time. We have a 6-month period where we're going to have 2 bienniums active at the same time. So we have to have separate line items for each different AY. So just some awareness on that. We can only link to one appropriation per cash fund. Now, this is just one screen that needs to be set up for linked cash to work. we also need some specific setup on the 62 screen for that linked appropriation. So in our example, it was appropriation 89901 that was linked, and we've got an example 62 screen here. Sabres, the DAS budget group, has to make a specific budget entry for how much you've been approved to borrow from for this appropriation. So if you have a linked appropriation on the 62 screen, you will see a balance type 24 for linked allotment. So in this case, I can see this agency has been authorized to borrow up to $500,000 from their general fund appropriation. So we have had some questions on this, if agencies have the setup correctly on the D23, but linking cash doesn't seem to be working as they would expect it to. Definitely check that 62 screen, make sure that linked allotment entry has been done. Sometimes at the beginning of the biennium, it may take a moment for Sabres to get that input so you can actually have that approved linked allotment working in the system. So now I want to talk through what it looks like on the 63 screen and another screen that you would use in your agency to monitor activity and how much you have available to spend. So with linking cash, as I mentioned, you will have the ability to go negative on the 63 screen because you're able to borrow some funds from general fund. So if you're looking at the 63 screen for your cash fund, you should normally never see a negative cash balance. We have edits in R-stars to prevent that, to make sure you're not spending more money than you have. But if you have linked cash, you may see a negative. So if I'm looking at a 63 screen and I see a negative, that's an indicator to me there's linked cash involved here somewhere. I might need to look at the D23 profiles to make sure I'm getting the complete picture, because ordinarily you should never see a negative cash balance on a 63 screen. So we have a separate screen that you use to see how much linked cash you have available. So if you're one of those agencies, you don't use linked cash, you looked at your D73s, there's none set up with a related appropriation, you don't need to look at this screen. It doesn't have any information for you. You would just use the 63 screen to monitor cash balances. But if you have linking cash, this is the screen you want to go to see how much you have available to spend. So on the 14 screen, you'll put in your agency. You'll put in the linked appropriation. So you won't be entering the cash fund anywhere on here. You'll be entering that appropriation that's linked on the D73 and the specific AY. And when you enter that information in, it's going to pull information from two different screens. So in the bottom left, we have amounts, appropriation of balances. Those are amounts from the 62 screen. It's taken directly from there. If you look towards the bottom, we have that balance type 24 linked allotment for $500,000 that we saw earlier. On the bottom right, it's pulling all of those same balance type balances that were on the 63 screen for that cash fund. So same information, it's just combining them on one screen. And then that linking balance is a calculated field. So it's taking what was your cash balance on the 63 screen, plus how much linked allotment you have. So we saw on the prior 63 screen example, I'm going to go back one slide really quick just to show you. It had a cash balance, a negative $432,000. So it's going to take that amount plus the $500,000 that you have been authorized to borrow from the general fund. So this agency in our example has a remaining linking balance available of $67,000 is how that works. So a little bit more about this 14 screen if you're one of those agencies that use it. Again, make sure to enter the linked appropriation in the AY on the 14 screen to correctly pull up information. You're not entering the cash fund, and it needs to be that linked appropriation. And I do want to point out the formula can be a little bit more complex than what we just went over. So the calculation is actually the lesser of these two items. Now, the first thing we went over, the balance type 24 linking allotment balance on the 62 screen plus the available D23 cash balance. That's what we just showed on the prior slide. That's typically what you see throughout the biennium. It's taking whatever's on the 63 screen as available cash balance. It's adding what you've been authorized to borrow from the general fund appropriation, and that's your balance. But if on the 62 screen, you've been authorized to borrow up to 500,000, but if you only have 200,000 allotment remaining, it's going to take that lower number because it's not going to let you spend more general fund than you have. It's not going to let you borrow the full 500,000 if you only have 200,000 left. So in that case, it's taking the remaining appropriation allotment on the 62 screen plus whatever balance was on your 63 screen for that cash fund. So we do get questions about that. Sometimes it comes up a lot more often at the end of the biennium because you're spending your general fund appropriations down. So you may not be able to go up to the maximum amount that you were authorized to borrow if there's not that much general fund remaining. Now, with linking cash, the last thing I wanted to go over was some specific error messages we see with linking cash. Again, if your agency doesn't use linking cash, you're not going to see these error messages. But if you do have linking cash, these are errors. They tend to be more common as we get closer to the end of the biennium. So you may not have seen them for a while, but now that we're getting close to the end of AY25, they might start to pop up for you. So the first error, KIO, any of our errors in the system that start with a K, those are warning errors. You can still save the transaction after you see that warning error. It's just giving you some additional information. This error is remaining appropriation is less than linking allotment. So this lets you know that it's using that second calculation. You don't have the full amount in the general fund appropriation available. So it's just kind of your warning that you're running lower on general fund appropriation and you're not able to borrow the full amount because you don't have that much remaining. If you see this message, it's just information for you. You can still press F10 to save the transaction and move forward. Now, the other errors that we have, the F07 and F08, they begin with F. They are fatal errors. You will not be able to save the transaction. These errors usually come together. They indicate that the linked cash balance is negative for the current month or for biennium end. So basically, this means you don't have enough cash available, even with your linking, to be able to pay this expenditure. So if you get into this situation, you won't be able to save the transaction. You're going to have to evaluate, if I need to make this expenditure, do I have to pay it out of another funding source? Do I need to do some sort of transfers to increase the balance on the 14 screen? Do I have federal reimbursements that are coming in? Maybe deposits on the 13 screen I can reconcile to increase that balance on the 14 screen. If we're already into July and we have that period where we have both AYs open, you may have to move that expenditure into the new AY because you'll have more appropriation in the new AY if it's still linked. And then you can accrue it for fiscal year end if you need to. So you may have to make some decisions once you get close to the end of the biennium if you're not going to be getting the federal reimbursements in time for that AY. Okay. Amber, do we have some questions in the chat?
We do have a question, and we'll see if we get some more. But is linked cash akin to what some ERPs call interfund cash, in that multiple funds can be pooled, thereby allowing negative fund balances in one fund, but only to the extent that the other fund balances exceed the negative balance of the other?
Okay, good question. It's actually a little bit different. So if you attended our basic training, we talked about D23 cash funds. Basically, if you have multiple D23 funds that all use the same account at Treasury, You can set up a D23 cash fund to pool cash across those D23 funds. So, one D23's cash balance may be negative, the other one's positive, but since it's all the same account and you've set up a cash fund, the system is considering it pooled. So you don't have to do individual cash transfers between D23 funds because it's all the same account. So to me, a D73 cash fund is similar to what you're talking about. Linking cash is something on top of that, where you're actually borrowing general fund money from an appropriation to be able to pay expenditures. And then you'll get the federal reimbursement. So those funds do go back to the general fund. So it's an added feature on top of the normal pooling that a D73 cash fund allows. To give you even more flexibility if you have that situation where you're having to make a lot of expenditures up front before you receive any reimbursement. Please let me know if that doesn't answer the question or if you've got additional questions as well.
He says, okay, thanks. I see where different configurations might prevail according to those different sets of circumstances.
Right. And the D73 cash fund, you don't have to have that extra layer of approval. You can request those when you're requesting your D23 fund. But with this linked cash functionality that I'm talking about, it does require a more formal approval process and review. Okay, we're at 2:30. I know some of you are enjoying our music. I like the chat. Please participate. We want to make these trainings as fun as they can. I know we're covering a lot of material today. One thing I was thinking over the break, just a last thought on linking cash I wanted to share. It can be confusing sometimes to figure out when would be the best example of when linking cash should be something your agency could consider. A good example of what we've seen in the past of when an agency may need to use linking cash, if it's a smaller agency and maybe they only have general fund appropriations, they get a federal award and now they have a federal fund, but it's reimbursable. They don't have another funding source to be able to cover those costs other than general fund while they're waiting for reimbursement. So that might be a great example where the linking cash functionality would be great. They could borrow from the general fund, but they could still be recording the expenditures to that new federal fund. It allows the 63 screen to go negative while they're waiting for reimbursement. So that's a great example of when linking cash might be something an agency wants to consider if they don't have another funding source other than general fund appropriations. Okay, so I'm going to move to a topic of GAAP fund and GASB 54 indicators. We have SARS with us here today. They're going to go into this information in a lot more detail than I can. But there are a few things system related that I wanted to talk about for the GAAP fund and the GASB 54 indicators, just how that activity rolls up in the financial system and how we use that information for some of our system jobs. So the first question that we've gotten previously in SFMS, and I think it's a good question to go over because I'm not sure how many people are really aware of all these different screens that we have in the system that shows how information is rolling up at that higher financial reporting level. We've got a lot of centrally maintained profiles in our accounting system that agencies don't really have much of a use to look at or may not know about, but I wanted to point these out because it can really be helpful for your understanding, especially if you like that bigger picture to see how all the data is flowing and how all of that is going to be eventually consolidated into the ACFR. So the question is, how do I tell whether a D23 fund in SFMA is classified as governmental, proprietary, fiduciary, or the government-wide reporting fund? There is a way to look this up within SFMA if you're not sure If you're looking at a D23 fund, you want to know what type it is. If you're reading a lot of the OAM guidance, there's a lot of references to make sure you record it this way if it's a proprietary fund, or you need to make sure you make this entry in the government-wide reporting fund. There is a way you can look at your D23 fund and figure out which bucket it sits in. So if you do have a second monitor and you want to pull up your R-stars and pull up a D23 fund for your agency and follow along, I recommend that. Otherwise, I'll just go through some of these screens that are useful to know if you want to see that roll up. So if you pull up a D23 fund for your agency, you'll see a GAAP fund listed on that. And when we have SARS speak later on, they will talk a lot more about what those GAAP funds are and what those considerations are. But from that GAAP fund, you can look up the GAAP fund on the D24 profile. So copy that GAAP fund number, go to the D24 profile, enter the GAAP fund, and you can get some more information. Specifically, it'll list a GAAP fund type. You can then copy that GAAP fund type and look it up on the D21 profile. The D21 profile, if you input that information, will give you the GAAP fund group. And then finally, you can go look up the GAAP fund group on the D20, and it will tell you if it's classified as a governmental fund, a proprietary, fiduciary, or the government-wide reporting fund. You can also, if you don't want to walk through all of those screens, if you go back to the D23, there will be the GAAP fund group listed at the bottom of the D23, what code that is. You could just skip straight to the D20 screen and see that information as well. So that's just some awareness of how things are rolling up for financial reporting. There's a lot more information on those different fund types in the Oregon Accounting Manual, but there's different accounting treatment depending on the type of fund that it is. And the OAM is a good resource. Your SARS analyst is a good resource if you've got more questions on that piece. For GASB 54 indicators and GAAP funds, we use this information in the system to determine where general ledger equity accounts, where nominal balances are going to close at the end of the fiscal year. So if you've been to some of our trainings before, when we talk about the general ledger close program that's run in SFMA to close the fiscal year, we talk about nominal balances a lot. If you want to know how you identify which GLs are considered nominal balances, these are the balances that are closing out at the end of every fiscal year. You know, what's showing up on your DAPR 6610 for revenue, expenditures, transfers in, transfers out. Those are just a few GLs. There are more. We've got the GAAP offsets and some others that are nominal and are closed out every year. You can go to our stars on the D31 screen and look up any GL, and it'll give you more information. There's an indicator that tells you if it's considered a nominal balance that's going to close out at the end of the year, or if it's a real balance, you know, cash, it's just going to keep rolling year to year as a cumulative balance. If you don't want to look up every single GL on the D31, we do have a list on our website that basically takes all that information and just puts it in a spreadsheet. So then you can see all of the different GLs that are available across the state, how they roll up, and you can filter, you know, I just want to see all the nominal GLs and get a complete list. So we hope you find that resource useful. I'm going to be updating it here shortly. We haven't had a lot of changes, but I try to always run an update about once a year just to make sure we've got the most up-to-date information on our website for the GL accounts and their roll-ups. So the GASB 54 indicator and the GAAP fund that's on the D23, those fields are used by our logic for the general ledger account close program. So after month 13 close, it's usually about 2 weeks after, we run the general ledger close program to close out all balances for the fiscal year, have any of those nominal balances close out to the appropriate appropriate equity account. And how that program determines what the appropriate equity account is based on those indicators, the G54 indicator, the GAAP fund on the D23 fund. So very important when you're filling out this information. It's why we keep these D23 profiles centrally maintained. It's why we have SARS has a role in the process to review those to make sure they're accurate, so we can make sure everything's working properly for financial close each year. So if you want to find out what equity account a specific D23 fund is closing to, we did have some of this information in the basic training with screenshots so you could follow along. But what you would do is you would go to your D23 fund and first check to see if it has a GASB 54 indicator. If it does, that indicator determines the equity GL accounts, and you can go to the D54 screen, enter GB54 for GASB 54 as the table ID, and input that GASB 54 indicator in the key one field, and it'll list and tell you which equity account that is going to close to for that specific GASB 54 indicator. There's a lot more information in the OAM on that. Again, SARS is going to be talking about it more later in today's training. If you're looking at a D23 fund that does not have a GASB 54 indicator, it's just blank, then it's the GAAP fund that determines the equity account that it's going to close to. You can look up the GAAP fund on the D24 to find the GAAP fund type. If you put the GAAP fund type in the D21, it'll tell you what the associated equity account is when that activity in that fund is closed out. So just some information on how you can look things up and how you can see how the information on your D23 fund is controlling some of those system jobs. Now, GAAP fund and GASB 54 indicators, they are some of the few fields that can be changed on the D23 fund. We'll talk more about that at the end as well. But one thing I want to point out is anytime you're changing that GAAP fund and GASB 54 indicator on an existing D23 fund that SARS has approved, you may also need to do some additional entries to reclass equity. This isn't something that's extremely common, but it's good to be aware of if your agency runs into this situation. There's kind of two different scenarios where we may see this. So whenever we change a profile in our STARS and it's already been used to record transactions, it doesn't go back when we make that change and update how things have posted previously. So if you had this D23 fund for a couple fiscal years, and then the third fiscal year, you realize, oh, we need to change how this is classified. SARS has told us it needs to be a different GASB fund or different G54 indicator. And that change is going to change what equity account balances should close to. After we update the profile, there may also need to be an entry just to reclass that equity GL balance to the correct one. We also have a less common situation that can occur depending on the exact timing of when you're making a change. If you make a change to a GAAP fund or GASB 54 indicator that's going to change the equity account the first year of a biennium, and you do it between specific system jobs we run, we could have a situation where you may have to do a reclass in the second year of the biennium. It's pretty uncommon, but we have seen it. The main takeaway is that if you are changing your GAAP fund and GASB 54 indicator and you've already recorded transactions on that D23 fund, you may have to do a reclass entry. This usually comes up in SARS pre-close reviews. SARS may see multiple equity accounts for one D23 fund, balances and multiple equity accounts, and they may request that you make a reclassification entry. So that can occur if there are changes during the course of the life of that D23. So any questions on the specific information I went over? I know we're going to be talking more about GASB 54 and GAAP funds later on.
There is a question, Liz. They ask, what's the difference between the 4 classifications And I believe that that's referencing the governmental proprietary, fiduciary, and government-wide.
Yes, and I would say that's a really good discussion to have with your SARS analyst. It is covered in the Oregon Accounting Manual. They have different bases of accounting, so you may have to record things differently depending whether it's a governmental fund. You may need to make partner entries in the government-wide reporting fund. If it's a business-like operation, you might have to record things differently. So you'll see references in the OAM to different treatments. You'll see some of our T codes even have different titles for those to be used for fiduciary or to be used for the government-wide reporting fund.
Awesome. So hold the question.
Yeah. Okay.
Don't see any more though. Thank you, Liz.
Okay, so the next section, I did mention a little bit about SFMA system jobs. I mentioned the General Ledger Close program. I do want to briefly go over some of that information just for your awareness. The D23 Fund is a really critical profile. A lot of the jobs that we run in our system to maintain the system and close out General Ledger at the end of the year use information on that D23 Fund profile. So I want to talk about a few of those jobs that look up that D23 Fund profile information. And I do see a question real quick. When you said GASB 54 indicator, is that just the GASB 54 field? Yes, same thing. Yep, it's that, A1, R4, those codes. Okay. So some system jobs that use the D23 Fund. The first we have is called the DAFM 353-356. That's just the name of the job that we run in the system. What it is the fiscal year end rollover. So we run this every last working day of June, every fiscal year to populate balances for the new fiscal year. So at the end of June, calendar date June, we want to make sure we're starting fiscal year 27, July 1. Then we want to make sure you have beginning balances for fiscal year 27. This is populated all the beginning balances for your agency. As both fiscal years are still open, you're still making your entries for fiscal year 26 and let me step back and make sure I'm doing the right fiscal year. We're closing fiscal year 25 this year. So when we do this job this year, we're going to be populating fiscal year 26 beginning balances. We'll still have fiscal year 25 and fiscal year 26 open. There's a period of time where we have both open through month 13. So once we run the job the end of June, you'll see beginning balances populated in fiscal year 27. If you go to the 89 screen and are looking up records for fiscal year 27, you'll see a beginning balance there. The system, if you're still recording transactions in fiscal year 26, it's going to continue to update that beginning balance so it remains accurate all the way until we actually close month 13. So the logic that's done to roll over the balances at that time at the end of June is looking at your D23, because any of those nominal balances, they're going to be zero in fiscal year 27, and any of that amount is going to be in the beginning balance for the associated equity account. And as you post transactions, it's going to update those beginning balances until fiscal year 25 has closed. So that's one of the jobs kind of behind the scenes. There's no action needed by the agency. We're running that just so you have beginning balances for the new fiscal year and that information remains accurate. I mentioned the other job, the DAFM 351 General Ledger Close. We run that following month 13 close to finalize everything, close out all the nominal balances to the appropriate equity accounts. There is some responsibilities for agencies just to verify things worked correctly. We send out a lot of information on this to our SFMS news list. We do have some information. I'll provide some links to the desk manuals that talk more about these jobs if you want more information. But the main takeaway here is we are using that information on the D23 Fund. These specific jobs have logic that look up the D23 Fund information to ensure they're rolling balances and closing out GLs appropriately. We do have a couple other jobs that use the D23 fund or have an impact with the D23 fund. We have the profile roll. We just ran that last month. What that does is it rolls over any profiles that you had in AY27 or AY25 to AY27, just to make sure that we're keeping the profiles that you need as we get ready for the new biennium. D23 funds are included in that. So you will see profiles on the D23 for fiscal year 26 and 27. And that's because we did that profile roll to have those populated throughout the new AY. We also, in even numbered years, run the profile archive. So we're doing the profile roll every spring before the start of a new biennium. In odd numbered years, we're doing the profile archive in even number years to clear off any old AY and fiscal year profiles from the system, just to keep it clean. We don't need to, see profiles from AY19 on there anymore. There's specific criteria for that archive. We send out more information on SFMS news about that. But D23 funds are included in that. So you're not going to see your really old fiscal year D23 fund setups because that archive is clearing them off every 2 years. So if you're interested, that's just an overview of those jobs. We have a lot more information if you want to know what they're doing and the logic for them in our desk manual. So here's links to each of those. We don't have a link for the profile archive. We do send out that information on SFMS News, but that one's not quite as complex. If you have questions on any of this information, feel free to reach out to me. You can reach out to your SFMS analyst for your agency as well, and we can answer questions about those system jobs. If you are not part of our SFMS news list, let us know. We can provide more information in the chat on how to sign up for that, because we always send out notices when we're running these jobs of any information that you need. It's also on our SFMS calendar, the timing of when we run these different jobs. Any questions?
So there was lots of activity in the chat. Sorry, Liz, but I think that we've got most of them answered. And then there is the links to the previous question. Valia put the OAM there, but I did want to read Deborah's question, and then there's an answer. And so, but just so that they all get on the recording, what should you do if you think the GASB 54 is wrong? And Carlene just said that if the D23 is already set up and is open and active in RSTARS, please contact your SARS analyst. They're the ones that review these at setup, and if there's needed changes, they are the ones who have to approve them. So SARS is coming in just a little bit, and they expound upon that, but I did want to make sure that that got in the chat. And then Brittany asked for the link to the SFMS news list. I will definitely put that in the chat in just a moment.
Perfect. Thank you, Amber. All right. I'm going to turn it back over to Carlene next to talk about how to close out some of these funds.
Hi. Okay, we've been talking a lot about open and active D23s. Now let's talk about, I want to close these things because all of the activity has been completed. We no longer need them. We've moved all the activity off to another D23. For whatever reason, we want to close D23s, Treasury funds, and if there are associated D73s, we want to get those closed down too. We can do that. There's a form for that. I believe this form came into existence last year. Love it, hate it, I don't know, but it makes things a lot easier, I think, for a lot of people. On the SFMS webpage, where a lot of our information is held lovingly and updated continuously, under Forms is a D23 Fund and Treasury Account Close Request Form. This is a Word document. I've tried to make it as easy to complete and fill out as possible, but we do have a form for that. We used to do this all through emails, and it necessitated a lot of toing and froing. I cannot tell you how much in the last year the excess emails have slowed down for all parties concerned. So I hope you enjoy that, at least an aspect of this form. Anyway, this form was developed and placed into service about a year ago. A primary purpose was ease for agency use, create a uniform request for processing, and create a single source of request for ease of processing for SFMS. It was created as a fillable Word doc and should be emailed to the D23 email mailbox, which is a monitored email box. Anyway, no review of this form will take place at this time during this training because we already went over a lot of it. So please refer to the D23 basic training if you need to know how to fill out this form. I'm just telling you, this is the form you need to fill out. SFMS processing for closing a Treasury account, what we do once we receive this form is we run a query on all the associated, for looking for all associated D23 funds attached to this Treasury account. And then we run a query on all the D23 funds to assure that this request will be successful. We're looking for 0 balances in all the real accounts, with equity being the one exception. You can have a balance in the equity account, but what we're looking for is a 0 balance primarily in cash, unreconciled cash, any of the other real account balances. These are, and then we're looking also for a 0 balance in the 1011 and 111 JL accounts, because this would indicate that there is an outstanding warrant and that there should be funds still available at Treasury to cover these outstanding warrants. We then send an email to Treasury requesting the closure of this account, including all. So if you sent me this request form with 5 people from your agency who've been who have a stake in knowing that this Treasury account is closed or D23 account is closed, I'm going to send a request to Treasury with all of those people and yourself, the original sender of the email, on the request to Treasury and say, yes, please close this account. It's a 0 balance. Email then will be received from Treasury confirming that the closing process has been completed on their end, and then I will proceed to close the profiles, all the centrally maintained profiles in RStars. SFMS process to close a D23 fund should be requested if closing a Treasury account. So if you have a Treasury account and a D23 that are associated with one another, can be requested even if the Treasury account is not being closed. If there are multiple D23s in existence, so long as that D23 fund is at a 0 balance and is still appropriate to close, which means I run a query to make sure that there are no real account balances in there other than equity. There are no outstanding warrants on that fund, and the make sure that the appropriated fund is anything other than 30-20, 60-20, I didn't include it, but 40-20 and 80-20. And these are all capital construction appropriated funds. They're D23s with these appropriated funds cannot be closed in RStars. So then I will proceed to close in RStars if they are appropriate to close. Our process for closing general fund D23s. Alas, there does come a day occasionally when a general fund D23 needs to be retired. I run a query for that. On the requested D23 fund closure, to assure that the identified real balances are at zero. However, sometimes it's found that there are positive balances that exist in the GL70 on this fund, and I need to notify the agency that they should transfer the funds to agency 999 SFMS to zero balance. Please use a T code 720, 721, and you can contact either me or the SFMS analyst for coding instructions for how to successfully get these funds transferred back to the general fund. By the way, agency 999 is general fund. So there you go. Negative balances, if a negative balances exists on it in the GL0070, that's where I get to transfer money to your account to make that fund at zero. However, if there are any balances on the 1011 or 1111 GL accounts, there's outstanding warrants. We still can't close that D23 fund. And again, if the APD is a capital construction APD, appropriated fund, 30-20, 40-20, 60-20, 80-20, then those cannot be closed. But other than that, I can proceed to close to R-stars as soon as that GL balance is zero, which is the GL70. SFMS process to close this D73 is we can close this only if all associated D23 funds are closed. It actually will error out if I try to close it and there's an associated D23 fund still open. So there again, unfortunately, if these cash funds are associated with a D23 that has an appropriated fund that is capital construction, I cannot close them. It all has to do, frankly speaking, it all has to do with financial archive. And we have found that there are issues with financial archives if these capital constructions, D23s, don't remain open and active. Anyway, then we proceed. But if they are open, if they are appropriate to close, we can close them in R-stars. Additional notes. What is closed doesn't always remain closed. Remember, there's always an exception to every rule. Well, this is our exception to the exception. Occasionally, you will find out, you'll be notified that you need to reopen a Treasury fund, and you don't want to create a new Treasury fund. You just want to use the old D23 and the old Treasury fund. Agency may need to reopen previously closed profiles for accounting purposes or for other reasons. All of a sudden, you're getting money in that you weren't expecting. Profiles can be reactivated. You just need to send me an email at d23sfms@dasoregon.gov and request what profiles need to be reactivated. If you are reactivating a Treasury account, make sure if you need to reactivate a D23 that is included in the email, and a D73 if it's appropriate. If you are reopening a new Treasury account but you want a new D23 fund, then you need to wait till the Treasury fund is open before you send in a new D23 request form. Easiest if you're opening the Treasury fund and the old Treasury fund and the old D23 fund, but I understand that sometimes agencies go through major reorganization with their accounts, and it may need to be updated to follow those conventions. Anyway, if you have any further questions, please contact me. If there are any questions you want to ask me at this time for the greater good of everyone, please hopefully put it in the comment section. I love
Perfect.
Questions.
We do have some questions, and it does sound like you'll be getting some closed forms from a bunch of people. So they have a handful for you. But Michelle asks that she has a handful of old D23 numbers with no title showing up on her DAFR 8650 trial balance by fund general ledger report. Is there a way that she says, can I check to see if these are open or closed? Maybe this is a report ordering question rather than a D23 training question, but will these fall off the report eventually, or do they need to be closed to be removed from the report somehow?
Oh, that sounds like a phone conversation or a Teams meeting, Michelle. Well, I'm announcing it to the world. I'll be out on Friday and Monday, but if you want to contact me tomorrow or not Monday, but Tuesday, everybody's out on Monday, go ahead and arrange a Teams meeting, and I would love to go through this with you. That sounds interesting.
Perfect.
Carlene, I would just add, let me know if you have any questions. My guess is typically when we see no title, it means it's a really old D23 fund that has archived off. I wouldn't expect, Michelle, for you to be seeing balances there. Then we might need to review it, but it could be a report ordering of maybe we just need to not include those older funds so you're not seeing that continually.
Yeah, I just wanted to see what was going on. That's
perfect. Michelle says she's going to give you a call, and thanks, Liz. And then Brian Brian Gonzalez says that please remember that Treasury may take up to 5 days to process an account closure request. Treasury fees will continue to accrue until an account is closed. Treasury cannot close an account with a cash balance. There can be a timing delay between when SFMA indicates a zero balance and when Treasury systems indicate a zero balance. And while closed accounts can be reactivated, there is no ability to temporarily inactivate an account. An account is either open or closed.
correct. Yes.
Awesome.
And for more, we went through a lot of this at the basic training. So Brian brings up really good points.
Awesome. Okay. I don't see any more questions.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna pass this off to Smriti, and she is one of our SARS analysts. She's gonna talk about.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? My name is Smriti Vista, and I am a SARS analyst. Awesome. I'm a SARS analyst here at SARS, and I'm going to discuss the SARS portion of the review of the D23 Fund and the GAAP Fund selection decision because they both go hand in hand, so I would be discussing both at the same time. And as it had already happened, I also like everyone to know that I would be letting you know that you can drop your questions at the chat, and then my amazing boss, can you believe she did not pay me to say that she's amazing, but she's an amazing boss. So she would be answering all the questions that you may have as we go forward. And if you still have any further questions, I'm happy to answer them at the end of my session. So let's get started. Amber, can you help me with? Yep, thank you. So as we're starting, I would like to let everyone know what we focuses on. Once the D20 fund is submitted and it comes to the SARS, SARS only focuses on the 3 elements of the D23 fund request. And those 3 elements are GAAP fund, GASB 54 code, and GASB 54 code description. And someone might, everyone would be wondering why only 3 elements of all D23 request. So let's break it down why we only look at the 3 elements. So let's begin with the GAAP fund. Because all the D23 fund requests that has been submitted, they all roll up to the GAAP fund that has been selected, and then the GAAP fund decides how it directly relates to the financial reporting of the financial statements, and that financial statement reports on the ACFR. And since we publish ACFR every year, it would make sense for us to look at the GAAP fund selection decision that has been made. And then for the GASB 54 code, because the GASB 54 code is directly related to how equity is posted in the government fund and which also impacts the financial reporting, we look at the GASB 54 code. And when it comes to GASB 54 code description, because we need to confirm the restriction on the use of the funds that align with the GASB 54 code, and that is selected and is in line with the requirements of the specific GASB 54 code. That's why we look at that description also. And then there might be also a question on why SARS look at it versus other units. The answer is pretty much similar on because SARS is the one who publishes an ACFR on a yearly basis, it would make sense for us. And those three things directly related to the ACFR, financial reporting of the financial statement, which eventually goes to the ACFR. So it would make sense for us to look at that versus other units. Let's change the slides. And Amber, can we? Yeah, thank you. As we are going further into, I want to start with the GAAP fund and what we look into the GAAP fund in more detail. So when it comes for a GAAP fund, the questions I have here is basically a replica of our procedure that we go through every time we have a D23 request that comes to us. So every time we have a D23 request, we would be asking ourselves, like, does the GAAP fund seem logical for the activity that it will be accounted in it? So we look for the purpose of the D23 fund and its correlation to the relevant GAAP fund that records a similar activity. So for example, if a fund accounting is for educational program, then it would be logical to put it in a educational support fund, GAAP fund 1105. And if the program is for preserving wildlife habitat, that would be logical to put it in an environmental management fund in GAAP fund 1107. And the other question we also think about would be, does the agency already have used this GAAP fund? Typically, we would expect agencies to use GAAP fund that they have used previously in past for similar activities. The new D23 GAAP fund can be created as new activities are added. So here I have given an example, a famous example of GOJ receiving a Monsanto settlement for an environmental protection in GAAP fund 1107, which is not a common thing. So they went ahead and created a new D23 fund just to have their settlement accounted for. And to refer back to the question of Liza, where she wanted to know what are the 4 different classification of the government GAAP funds. If you refer to the OIM chapter 520 appendix A, pages 6 to 11, it gives you all the details of GAAP fund descriptions of all of them. And if you can refer to that link to learn more about what the GAAP funds are, what the GAAP funds are, how GAAP funds are used and everything. So moving forward, we also wanted to know if the GAAP fund is compatible with an appropriated fund. So for the appropriated fund that begins with 8, it would go to the general fund 0001. Even though we have 2 different general fund, it would only go to the 001. And there are like a few considerations that we would like to think about when it comes for an GAAP fund being compatible with an appropriated fund. So if the appropriated fund is if the appropriated fund has 3 in the 3rd digit, agency may have related GAAP fund in Debt Service Fund 2001 to 2003, the series 2000, but it may again can go to any other GAAP fund. And if the appropriated fund has 1 or 2 in the 3rd digit, it usually is for capital construction and improvement. An agency may have related GAAP fund in Capital Project Fund 3001, but again, that is not a requirement, it's just a possibility. So it can go to any other fund as well. And now if you want to learn about the different appropriated fund or other funds, you can refer back to OIM chapter 520.00, Appendix B, pages 12 to 13. It just talks about the appropriated funds. Let's go to the next slide. And as we're talking about the GAAP fund selection here, I think it would be considerable to look at the new debt or a bond issuance. And it is important to review if the new D23 fund request is for debt service payment just for the interest or the principal payment, or is it for the bond process? So if the new D23 fund is for debt service payments just for the interest and a principal, the agency may have related GAAP fund be a debt service fund, GAAP fund 2000 series 2001 to 2003, but no proceeds should be recorded in the debt service fund. The use of the debt service fund is not required. But if the D23 fund is for bond process, the related GAAP fund will likely be a governmental fund. So GAAP fund starting with 0011, the 2000 series 301 or 7505, those would be the right accounts. And if the bond is related to capital construction, the agency may choose to use the capital project fund GAAP fund 3001 to record the process, but again, it's not required to do so. So if you again want to learn further on this topic specific to the debt service payment and the bond issuance, you can look at OIM 156510, paragraph 108 and 109. It specifically talk about those topics that I have just mentioned. Let's go further. So now that we talked about the GAAP fund, I think it is also a good idea to determine if special revenue fund is applicable. And before doing that, I think first thing we need to determine if the funding source is a special revenue fund or not. So to determine if the funding, to determine if it's a special revenue or not, we have to determine the funding source. If the funding source is restricted and committed combined together, so for example, if it's in a federal revenue or fees, assessment, taxes, a structure like that, that must be used for a specific purpose, then the special revenue fund is most likely appropriate. And other thing we want to look when it comes for special revenue is the special revenue GAAP fund has already been used. So if the agency does not already report activity in the GAAP fund in question, and the only money going into the GAAP fund will be a net transfer in, a special revenue fund is not appropriate. GAAP fund 0054 GASB 54 general fund would be an appropriate GAAP fund to use this new D23 fund. But if the agency already account for the activity in the GAAP fund in question, we review the operational statement DAFR 6610 for last 2 years. So we won't be looking for the current year, but the last 2 completed years to see the annual revenue reported in the GAAP fund. How much is it? And then under the GASB 54, a substantial portions of inflow into the special fund must be restricted or committed combined. And SARS has determined that to be in a 30% or more, then only it can be considered as a special revenue fund. So if you wanted to learn further on what are the specifics of the substantialness, you can look back to the OIM 520.00 paragraph 109B and the 4th paragraph of the introduction on Appendix C. And there is also a way to determine once you know the substantial portion being 30% or more, and if you wanted to make in a test if it's in a special revenue or not, there is a way to do a special revenue GAAP fund test. For that, if you look at the OIM chapter 520 Appendix C, page 13 to 16, it will give you a step-by-step process on how to do a special revenue GAAP fund test. And that should tell you like how to go about that, if it's a special revenue fund or not. I wanted to mention one thing though, like it is an agency's responsibility to consider whether a special revenue fund is appropriate when D23 funds are established. It's just in the general idea I was saying. And then now that we have to discuss the GAAP fund, another thing we really focus on would be a GASB 54 code. So let's begin with GASB 54 code's background, when it came from and what it refers to. So GASB 54 code came in 2009 and Oregon implemented it in 2010. And here I have added in a government accounting research system GARS summary of GASB 54 pronouncement. The purpose of this statement is to improve the usefulness of the fund balance information by introducing clearer, more consistent fund balance classification and refining the definition of government fund types. It creates a hierarchical structure of a fund balance categories based on the level of a constraint placed on how government can use the resources in their government funds. And then if you want to learn further about other GASB pronouncement or even just with the GASB 54, I have added a link to the GARS website here. Now let's go to GASB 54 code and when we would be using it versus when not. So GASB 54 code and description both combined is only required when the D23 funds are rolling up to the governmental GAAP fund. It is not required for a proprietary fund, the 4000 series and 5000 series. It is also not required for a fiduciary fund, the 6000 series and 7002, and for the GWRF, the government-wide reporting fund, 8500. So we only use the GASB 54 whenever agencies are submitting a D23 request. You would only be using a GASB 54 code or a code description when it comes for GAAP funds that starts with 00, 11, 20, 30, or 75. And if you want any further guidance on determining and fund balance classification, you can again refer back to chapter 15, 8500 Appendix A, page 6 to 8. That also gives you enough further classification of how the GASB 54 code can be used. And here I have listed out a quick snip of all the GASB 54 code and their GASB 54 fund balance description. It can be used as a quick cheat sheet when it comes for using or knowing what the shorter and then longer form of the GASB 54 code. And I think it would be a great idea for agencies to have it handy. So now we have the list of all the GASB 54 fund balance description. I'm going to discuss further on all the GASB 54 code, like restricted versus other fund balances and when to use them and how to use them. Let's start with the restricted fund balance description. So for GASB 54 code R1, agencies want to ask if your agency use a resource in this fund restricted to a specific purpose imposed by any federal laws, federal regulations, or federal grant agreements, then only you want to use code R1. If not, we wanted to use for some other codes. I would like to mention that, like for all the questions that I have here for restricted fund balance and other fund balance, you only want to use that code if your agency would giving like when you are deciding this, if the GASB 54 code would be in the right one. Only if the answer to the question is yes, then only you want to use this. Otherwise, you do not want to use that code, or you have to find the code until you find that yes answer to the question. So going forward with an R2, is your agency's use of resource in this fund restricted to a specific purpose imposed by an Oregon constitution? The examples can be common school, funds resources, lottery proceeds, or motor vehicle use, fuel taxes. And again, if the answer is yes, then only you want to use R2. Otherwise, if answer is no, then you want to look for other codes. For R2, the answer needs to be on the two folds. So we look for not just one question, but two questions. And if both of the questions are saying yes to the answer, then only you want to use code R3. So is the restriction on the agency's use of resource contained in legislation that also authorize the states to assess, levy, charge, or collect the resource from external parties? And is the restriction on the use of the resource legally enforceable? So just to understand, there are like two folds to this question. The first one is, does the legislation authorize the collection of a specific revenue? And in the same legislation, limit its use to a specific purpose. So it has to be two-way. If both of the answers would be yes, then only you want to use R3. Otherwise, we have to look for something else, some other codes. So now for the R4, is your agency's use of resource in this fund restricted by the terms of debt covenants for payments of the debt service? It can also be restricted by the terms of certification of participation agreement, bond indenture, or state law to fund special capital projects. Again, if the answer is yes, then you want to use it. If no, then you want to look for something else. For GASB 54 code R5, is your agency's use of resource in this fund restricted by condition imposed by donor? Answer yes, then use it. If it's by the donor, then you want to use R5. If not, then you want to use for something else. So now that we have discussed the restricted fund balance, I want to discuss further on the other fund balances. So for committed fund balance, code C1 is the law that places limitation on the use of the resources in this fund separate from the law authorizing the state to access, levy, charge, or collect this resource. Then it would be a good idea to use that. If not, then we do not want to use that. So for assigned fund balance, is the represented resource that are limited by the state intend to use them for a specific purpose. The intent may be expressed by a governing body itself. Another body can be a budget committee or a designated official. These resources are neither restricted nor committed to a specific purpose by external parties. Then you want to use assigned fund balance. In government funds, other than the general fund, assigned fund balance represent the remaining amount that is not restricted by committed or restricted or committed. And for the unassigned fund balance, the code U1, if the appropriated fund category on D23 profile is 8800, then you want to use an unassigned fund balance code. And if the D23 fund profile is not 8800 but still in an 8000 series, then you want to use an assigned fund balance code A1. So now that we have discussed the code description, we want to know, does the, can we go to the next slide, please, Amber? So thank you. So when we're looking at the GASB 54 code, we wanted to make sure it looks reasonable and it is compatible with an appropriate fund and GAAP fund. And I also wanted to mention that we look at the appropriate fund in two levels, one at the GAAP fund decision level and one at the GASB 54 code level. Now that we have already chosen a GAAP fund, and we want to see the GASB 54 code is relevant with an appropriate fund and a GAAP fund. So for the appropriate fund that begins with 4, which are lottery money usually, you want to use R2, restricted by Oregon Constitution Code. And if the appropriate fund begins with 6, the federal funds, then you want to use R1, restricted by federal laws, federal regulation, or federal grant agreements. For the appropriate fund, 8800, general fund revenue, I think I have already mentioned this, but I still want to have, again, I think this also can be a really good cheat sheet in terms of like when you have this appropriate fund, maybe use this code, and then if you have this appropriate fund, use this code. But that's up to the agency. So like for the appropriate fund, which has 8,000 series, but not in, which has 8,800, and that is on general fund revenue, you want to use an assigned U1, the unassigned fund balance code. And then if the appropriate fund is an 8,000 series, but it's in the general fund expenditure, you want to use an assigned fund balance A1 code. For the debt service fund, the 2000 series, for certificate of participation and general obligation bonds, it is appropriate to use R4 because the restriction is by the debt covenants. And for lottery money or ODOT funds accounting for highway user taxes, weight mile taxes, or other taxes authorized in the Constitution, it is appropriate to use R2 as the restriction is by Oregon Constitution. Now that we have discussed the GASB 54 code, we wanted to discuss further on the GASB 54 code description. So what to mention in the GASB 54 code description? So based on the GASB 54 code, we would add a description in the given order. This is our recommendation as a SARS to do not adding anything else to the GASB 54 code description. And somebody might ask, like, why we wanting to be so so much into just adding the description but nothing else. We wanted to standardize our process of how the D23 fund looks, and we want to keep it clean when it comes for D23 funds GASB 4 code description. So it is recommended by the SARS to just add these information but nothing else in the GASB 54 code description. So for R1, we recommend just to add grant number or assistant listing number, which used to be called CFDA. If not available, then add Code of Federal Regulation, CFR reference, or other federal reference. For R2, you want to just add constitutional article, section, and subsection as it is required. For R3, you just want to add the year, law, chapter, section, subsection, or ORS reference, Oregon Constitution Revised Statute reference. And for R4, you just want to add year of a debt issue and the series. For R5, you want to add name of a donor, type of agreement, and date of agreement. For a committed fund balance, code C1, we only want to add Oregon revisited statute, ORS, or other reference that shows the constraint. For A1, assigned fund balance, it is recommended to add the general description, but not just adding an assign to it, because it's more like a repetition of what the fund already, what the code is. So instead of adding just an assign, it is recommended if you can add some kind of a general description of the D23 fund. And for unassigned fund balance, U1, you want to add a type of a fund, general fund revenue. So that would be income tax, inheritance tax, or anything else that can go there. Moving on, for Senate or a House bill, it would be a good idea to include the year of the bill. So if the GASB 54 description reference a Senate or a House bill, does the reference include a year of the bill? It should be yes. Bill numbers are used over each year, so the year of the bill will be important in identifying it later. But for the budget bill, it is recommended not to include it. The GASB 54 description should not reference a budget bill. Budget bills are identifiable because they are typically in 5,000 series. The example would be a House Bill 5021. If the only revenue source is an appropriation of unspecified revenue and the only constraint on how to spend the resources is found in the agency budget bill, the fund balance should be classified as an assigned. So that should be A1. That's pretty much it of how what should be mentioned on the GASB 54 code description. Now here I have a quick example on next slide of two different kinds of GASB 54 code description. Can anyone tell me which one could be the correct way to fill out the GASB 54 code description versus an incorrect way to fill out the GASB 54 code description? You can tell one is correct, two is wrong, something like that. No? Okay. I was just trying to get a feel for the, okay. Harleen, you don't get to vote. You already know.
Valia answered too.
Valia, that's not fair. So if you think about the GASB 54 description, because the GASB 54 code is R4, and for R4, as we know, we just want the year of the debt, year of the issue, and then the description of the bond. Let's go back. What it says exactly? It says year of the debt issues and the series. So if you look at the first GASB 54 description, it has this extra information, which is relevant because it it's in a description of an R4, but again, it's not required to add that there. So I think it would be much more beneficial for everyone. I mean, if you want to add more information on the in regards to GASB 54 code, it would be beneficial to add that in the fund title versus in the GASB 54 description, because in the description we just want, for R4, we just want the year of a debt and the series, and we don't want anything else. And X is an example. X is not necessarily a series here. So yeah, it was just an example to show how we can have it like more cleaner GASB 54 code description versus little messier. If we have something like in one, we have to send it back and it needs to be corrected. We don't necessarily send it back the whole thing, but like Carlin has this extra step that she needs to go, which can be avoided if we can keep it clean. So with that, do we have any questions? Let's get back there. I think Valia had been answering it for me.
She has
There's lots of
answered one.
movement. Oh, looks
but
like there's a movement.
If you want to, do you want me to read it, or do you want to read the question? We want it to be on the recording, so we can, in case anyone is not following in the chat.
So I think it would be okay for you to go ahead and read it.
Okay. It says that, so if there is only a one-time inflow of funds, then it would be treated as a GAAP fund 0054 and not be treated as special revenue GAAP. It says, is this statement in the OAM for reference? And Valia answered, she's here if she wants to expound on it, but just that the OAM 5.20.00 states GAAP Fund 54 should be used if these activities are governmental, but don't meet the requirement to be reported in other GAAP funds. In Smriti's slide, she mentioned that if the agency doesn't already use the GAAP fund in question and the only activity is a transfer in, then it wouldn't be appropriate to use a special revenue fund. This latter statement is not in the OAM currently, but they are working on it for future reference in the OAM.
Right. So since we do not have any further questions, I would like to pass the deck back to Liz. And then if you have any further questions that you wanted to ask, if you do not want to ask here, but you still want to have it answered, you can reach out to your SARS analyst through Teams or email, or you can also reach out to the SARS website, which I have listed out here, to have it answered and get it clear. I would like to thank once again for having an active participation and listening to us. And given this isn't the first time for SARS being here, I would also like to have some kind of a feedback on how I did as a presenter. Is there anything else that can be added to our future training sessions? I would happy to listen to that and may make a suggestion as it come forward. Back to you, Liz.
Thank you, Smriti. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this is really valuable information for our attendees. If you've got feedback, you can reach out and let Smriti and Valia know. We also have our survey that Amber put in during the break, so we can pass that information on. But we appreciate having more perspectives here. And if there's additional information agencies want to see covered, please let us know. So we have one last topic today on our agenda for the planned agenda. This is just a reminder. We had the same information in the basic training, so it may be a refresher for you. What changes can be made to a D23 fund once it's submitted? We had some recent questions, so we just wanted to touch on it really briefly in today's training. Only certain fields can be changed on an existing D23 fund. If you've been to other presentations I've been a part of, you may have heard me say this before. Just like other SFMA profiles, making a change to the profile doesn't change anything retroactively with what's already been posted. So it really restricts what changes we can make on a D23 profile to not prevent system issues or data integrity issues. So again, really important to review those D23 profiles, make sure they're set up correctly. The following 4 fields we can change. The fund title. That's determined by the agency. SFMS reviews it for reasonableness, make sure it aligns with the related legislative requirement language. But if you want to have changes to that fund title to better describe what that fund is being used to record, you can request those changes to Carlene. We can make that update without any problems because that's just a title change. We can also make updates to the fields that Smriti went over, the GAAP fund, the GASB 54 code, and the description. We won't make any changes to those without SARS approval. So if you have a change you think is needed, please work with your SARS analyst. SARS may also reach out to us to request a change on behalf of your agency if something needs to be reported differently. We can make changes on those. I did mention earlier in the presentation, we may have to do a reclass entry. Your SARS analyst can work with you on that. We can also assist if you need T codes on what that reclass entry needs to look like. If it's an existing D23 fund and there's already an equity balance and it needs to be corrected, we can work with you on that. If you're wanting to change any other field on a D23 fund, unfortunately, you will need to request a new D23 fund. We don't like doing it. I know you don't like doing it. We try to get everything right to begin with. Make sure you're reviewing that information, because if you have the wrong Treasury fund, you didn't put a cash fund on it and you had the wrong appropriated fund, we can't just add that to the fund. We have to create a new fund. And if you've already recorded activity, that might mean you have to make some entries to move balances from the old fund to the new fund before we can close out the old one. So just want to reinforce that information, because it is a question that comes up. And there's a few things we can change, but the majority of things have to remain the same once it's been set up. So we are at the end of our planned agenda. We do have plenty of time left in the training, so we have time to open it up to questions on anything that we went over, anything D23 fund related. We want to make sure you're getting the information you need out of this training. So I will pause and see if we've got some questions in the chat, and we can stick around to kind of go through any of those before we wrap up.
Doesn't seem to be any questions, but it does say that we should call Carlene. And so Carlene's going to get some phone calls. If anybody has any questions, it just was suggested you can call Carlene. So give her a phone call.
Okay. I'm going to advance the slides. If you still have questions, please type them in. We've got our thank you. Please fill out the survey. I think Justin may have some wrap-up information as well, but if you've got questions, please put them in the chat and we will hang on and answer them.
Yes. Thank you to all our presenters today. That was wonderful information. I'm assuming because of the chat that it was so comprehensive that everyone answered everyone's questions. But I did want to get a chance to close this out by saying that SFMS is looking at all our trainings and trying to evaluate our collaborations with other departments. Shout out to SARS for being here with us today to kind of collaborate on the crosses of the D23. And please take the opportunity to fill out the survey that has been put in the chat. You can also feel free to reach out to me directly or any of the presenters today. And then also to, it has been asked before, so if people need to know, the survey is anonymous. So you could leave your wholehearted, honest feedback that we can then learn from and make our next presentation a better match for what you're looking for. So thank you all for attending. And if there are no other questions, we can go ahead and turn off the recording.